Hi and welcome to Whisky Shared. You're watching my exploration of liquid history. I'm Toby and you're watching Whisky Shared. Welcome to my exploration of liquid history. The guys at Lochs of Whisky, an online whisky retailer, were kind enough to send me samples of whiskies from the 1970s, 80s and 90s. They're a retailer which specialise in new and old whisky, and they even have whisky which was distilled back in the 1940s. They have an excellent Trustpilot rating, and buying old bottlings which are no longer for sale is a great alternative to auctions. They believe that whisky is more than a drink, it's a way of life. I'm inclined to agree with them as I really enjoy whisky. The whiskies I'm tasting today are the Haig Gold Label from the 1970s. It's 70 degrees proof or 40% ABV and retails for £115. The second one I'm tasting is the Antiquary 12-year-old from the 1980s. It's also 70 degrees proof, which is 40% ABV and retails for £120. The third one is the BlairMhor 8-year-old malt Scotch whisky. It retails for £65 and is 40% ABV. Should we find out what they taste like? On to the whisky. The first one I'm tasting is the Haig Gold Label from the 1970s. But before I start nosing and tasting, let's have a quick look at the colour. I'd say that is like a deep gold, but it is possibly coloured. I'm not sure if they were colouring back in the 1970s, but it is possible. But yeah, definitely a nice shade indeed. Let's start with the nose. Right, so I'm instantly getting a hint of sherry with this one. I'm getting dark fruits like raisins. There's some vanilla. There's some caramel. There's a little bit of furniture polish. But yeah, this isn't bad. There's a little bit of honey in there as well. But yeah, that polishy note is a little bit, it's sort of reminding me a bit of acetone now. But yeah, that sherry is definitely coming to the fore with this. Very nice on the nose indeed. Let's move on to the palate. Yeah, this is really nice, very punchy, lots of raisins, lots of dried dark fruit, bit of Christmas cake thrown in there. It's a little bit thin on the palate, but it has lots of tannins. There's lots of sort of grape skins. Really is noticeable. But it's a really tasty whiskey. I think at 40% ABV, I think, or 70 degrees proof, which is 40% ABV. I think this is not a bad ABV for this. I think it's obviously a mass market whiskey of its time, but yeah, I think it works well with the flavours coming across. Let's have another sip. Yeah, I'm getting a little bit of charred oak with this now. There's a slightest hint of that sort of furniture polish that I was getting. I'd say it's a little bit more beeswaxy now, but it's definitely tasty whiskey. I think you'd definitely be hard pushed to think this was an older whiskey. I've tried some older whiskies and they tend to have a mustiness. They tend to have something which sort of gives away that it's not an up-to-date bottling. But this, I easily could have thought that this is, you know, a high-end blend sherried whiskey from today. It really is deceptive and really is tasty. Whether or not I pay £115 for this, I think if I was a big Haig fan, definitely. Or if, you know, if I wanted to try something that was a little bit different, because to be fair, when you get sort of older bottlings at auction, this isn't one of those that I've seen that comes up regularly. So definitely interesting indeed. Let's move on to the next one. Right, so the next one is the Antiquary 12-year-old. It's from the 1980s. It's also 70 degrees proof, and it is basically 40% ABV. Let's have a quick look at the colour on this one. I'd say that's like a light gold, almost like deep straw colour. It's definitely got a bit of lightness to it, but again, this is one that I'm unsure is coloured, but my guess is probably not coming from Antiquary, but yeah, not entirely sure. If you know, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's start with the nose. Okay, so this is quite interesting. There's like an almost, I'd say, a slightly vegetal funk to this. Definitely think I'm getting some sherry with this. More like Fino style sherry. A little bit of raisins. Hint of green grapes. Definitely getting some malted barley. Yeah, this is really interesting. There's a hint of nail polish remover. And there, that sort of slightly funky vegetal note is definitely the dominating note on the nose. Bit of icing sugar, but definitely interesting. Let's move on to the palate. Okay, so this is much lighter than I was expecting from the nose, but it's not a bad thing. It's quite a refreshing dram. It's quite light to start, but on the back of my tongue I can feel some flavours building. There's definitely a sort of a light sherry note in the background. There's some sort of dry oak, sort of almost reminds me a little bit of pencil shavings, and it's ever so slightly ashy with those pencil shavings as well. It's unmistakably a low ABV dram. It definitely comes across like a 40%. But again, you know, being from the 1980s, again, I've had 1980s whiskies. There's something about this that doesn't overly come across as an older whiskey. It's obviously been kept well. It's been stored well, you know, on the shelf for its lifetime. So that's a good thing. And yeah, very tasty. Let's have another sip. Yeah, there's definitely a nice, lightly sherried dram. Definitely comes across as something like an Oloroso. I'd say it's like a finished whiskey. That's how it comes across. It's got a little bit of heat and a little bit of pepper as it sort of sits on the palate and evaporates. But yeah, the dominant features are a little bit of sweetness, a little bit of sherry, and a little bit of dry oak. But I think this is quite a well-rounded dram. It's obviously a 12-year-old. It's got some age to it, but it's yeah, it's reasonably tasty. This obviously retails, as I said earlier, for £120. As it happens, I didn't even know Antiquary went as far back as the 1980s. So it's really interesting to see that, you know, there is sort of liquid history around. There is stocks that people have, and obviously retailers like Lochs of Whisky have. So you can actually investigate, especially if there's a brand that you're getting into and you want to know what, you know, older versions of a particular distillery taste like, or a particular independent bottler or blend. It's a great place to investigate. Shall we move on to the next dram? So this whisky is the BlairMhor 8-year-old. It's a Scotch malt whisky, and it's one that I'm not familiar with at all. If BlairMhor is a brand you're familiar with, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's start with the colour. I'm not sure if this is coloured, but this is definitely a deep gold. It's definitely a nice shade. I think pulling this out of the tube and seeing the colour of the liquid, I think most people would be quite impressed. Let's start with the nose. Okay, so this is completely different to the other two. It's like waxed green apples. I'm getting a hint of tropical fruits as well. Oh, so sweet. It reminds me of sort of boiled sweets, but not overly synthetic. Wow, this is lovely and fruity. I just hope it tastes as well as it smells. Wow. That's really, really nice. Let's move on to the palate. Yeah, so this is interesting because overwhelmingly the flavours carry over to the palate, but there is quite a noticeable woody, oaky sort of flavour that comes through. It's quite dominant, but nowhere near as dominant as the sweetness. It almost reminds me slightly of tobacco. I'd say more like when you open a packet of cigarettes, not necessarily hand rolling tobacco. It's more that sort of slightly stale tobacco. It's not off-putting, it's just that's what it reminds me of. Let's have another sip. Yeah, it's definitely nice and fruity. Getting honey, getting apples, getting a hint of pineapple as well. There's icing sugar. It really is lovely and sweet, lovely and fruity. And yeah, that sort of woody tobacco note. Yeah, I think it complements it. It's probably a little bit stronger than I'd prefer. Maybe I'd prefer a touch lighter, but it's not off-putting. It's just, yeah, it's just a little bit more dominant than I'd like. This is definitely an interesting dram. It's definitely one that I'm going to look into a bit more. It's one of those whiskies that is obviously, you know, it's a peek into the past. This was obviously bottled in the 1990s. It's potentially 30 years old. So, yeah, it's a decent age. You know, there'll be people, you know, out there watching this video into whiskey that will be younger than some of these whiskies. Potentially, the first one is older than me as well. So, yeah, it's definitely great to have that opportunity to look back into the past. So I really must say thanks to Lochs of Whisky for sending me these samples. And yeah, I think the first thing I'm going to do is have a look at their back catalogue and see what they've got in old and discontinued whiskies. and see if there's something that takes my fancy. If you're interested in checking them out yourself, I'll put a link in the description. And yeah, if you think there's a whiskey that you think I should try, then let me know in the comments as always, and I'll check it out. Hopefully you found this interesting, and hopefully I'll see you again soon. Sauncher.
I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, why not give it a like or a comment, and please consider subscribing for more videos like this.